All right,
And
well, I think we should get going because I know we have a packed webinar today, and I want to make sure that our presenters have plenty of time and that all of you have plenty of time to ask questions. And we have two wonderful speakers today with so much to share on corn, as well as other topics too, but we'll focus on corn today. And just really excited to kick off our grain conference. Many of you usually this time of the year are traveling up to Vermont into Burlington, to the Inn at Essex, and we're hanging out there for the day, socializing, eating good food, tasting bread, learning about grain. But last year we had to cancel the conference because of the pandemic and not able to hold it in person this year either. But decided to put together a unique offering for all of our grain enthusiasts that we work with. And so I believe most of you know our week this week is called the Culture of Corn. So we'll be exploring the cultural and agronomic significance of specialty corns in the Northeast and beyond. And then next week, we're going to have a webinar series focused on rye and the following week on spelt. So hopefully you can join us for some or all of the webinars that we're offering. So today I'm joined by Jane Mount Pleasant, who's an emeritus professor in the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell University. And Jane studies indigenous cropping systems and their productivity from a multidisciplinary perspective that includes history, archaeology, paleobotany, and the cultural and social anthropology. Um, all of you have received, hopefully, your boxes in the mail and received a copy of the book that Jane wrote, and hopefully you've been enjoying that as much as I have. And she's been continuing to work tirelessly in this area. So we'll be hearing from Jane first, and then followed by Jane, Dr. Margaret Smith is going to present, and many of you have heard from Margaret before at our conference and many others. She's at Cornell University as well in plant breeding and genetics and is a corn breeder. And her research is primarily on field corn and emphasizes breeding for yield and adaptation in New York growing conditions, but also, our region as well, improving insect and disease resistance and breeding for organic systems. She's the extension leader for plant breeding and genetics, and she does a lot of educational programs like this. And we really appreciate both of them joining us today. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Jane.
okay, well, thank you very much for that nice introduction and explanation. And I note that you did say I'm emeritus, which means I'm retired, and I'm not, my speaking and lecture style is not quite as concise and crisp as it's been in the past. I need a little more practice, so I'm grateful that Heather invited me today. I'm going to talk about the Three Sisters. This is a traditional cropping system from what is present-day New York State, and I'm going to talk about two aspects of it. One, its surprising productivity, and then second, also the food value that comes from it. So what you're seeing here on the title slide, this is a piece of artwork that I really love, and it shows kind of the ways that Haudenosaunee people. I'm actually Tuscarora, one of the Six Nations of the Iroquois Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and this just shows the view of Haudenosaunee people of the Three Sisters, that they're actually family members. So if you're not familiar with the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee, you may know them as the Six Nations Confederacy, people of the Longhouse, and we call ourselves Haudenosaunee, which actually means people of the Longhouse. And we are native peoples who've lived in the eastern woodlands for many centuries, and perhaps migrated from the south or the west. The Confederacy was one of the most powerful political and economic entities in eastern North America for several hundred years, 1400 to 1800. And of course, today we're talking a lot about maize or corn. And in Iroquois, it was controlled by women. Women are very important as clan mothers. They have important political and cultural obligations and power. And much of that power traditionally arose from the fact that they were corn planters. Corn was often intercropped with beans and squash in fields that were most likely continuously cropped or cultivated. In other words, this was not what you might think of as shifting cultivation. The Iroquois were also located on very productive soils that run across the center of New York State. These are alpha soils, and it's still where large portions of our agriculture resides. The crops were also planted without plows. There was no draft animals. So this was a hand agriculture. This is again a lovely drawing that kind of shows the three sisters. These are three crops: corn, bean, and squash. And also importantly, they're planted in mounds or on hills. I'm not going to talk much about the mounds today, just very quickly, because we're going to spend most of our time on the crops. But this is a photo from eastern Massachusetts in the early 1900s. And this was known to be an old Indian planting field. And you see these fairly large mounds that are pretty carefully and regularly placed across the landscape. So the question is, why use mounds? Why not just plant on the flat? And it turns out that using mounds, you might also think of them as raised beds. They have very important functions in many cropping systems, and in the Three Sisters, they are critically important. They control plant population and spacing. They improve the soil physical environment. And in New York State, with our cold, wet springs, it turns out to be really important. They're also a means to reduce soil erosion and compaction. They concentrate and recycle nutrients because you're putting all of the crop residues right back into those mounds. And they're also a way of facilitating weed control. Talking about the soil physical environment very quickly, this is a picture that looks very typical of spring in New York State. This is at the Musgrave Research Farm, and you see corn has been planted, and in the foreground, standing water, and those little corn seedlings will struggle to come up through it, and they will actually, in many cases, be hindered in their growth and development throughout the entire growing season. You will notice differences in the corn growth and yield from these plants up front as opposed to those back there. Also notice over to the right that the landscape, the soil, the field looks different, and that's because over there the corn is planted in mounds, and you get a very visual observation that even when there's standing water, when the corn seedlings were planted in the mound, they come up and they're out of that water. The mounds actually work because they increase surface area, so the soil warms up more quickly in the spring, and you get extra depth of the soil so that it drains a bit more easily, and so the corn plants will just do better for the entire season. So mounds are really important, but today we're going to talk about the plants, and the Three Sisters you're probably familiar with, of corn, beans, and squash. And when they're growing like this in the field, it looks pretty wild. I'm sure you all recognize the corn. The bean is this is a scarlet runner bean that uses the corn to the stem of the corn to twine around. And then at the At the base, on the ground, are these very large leafed squash or pumpkin, which are pretty aggressive in covering all the areas in between. Well, people, the three sisters, the crops are in any polyculture system, the crops are not chosen at random, but rather each has a pretty specific purpose. And so if we're thinking about corn, it's the engine of this, system. It produces very large amounts of calories. It also has a modest but a pretty significant amount of protein. It's incredibly competitive against weeds and resistant to insects. If you think about corn plant compared to a wheat plant, the corn plant may be, 6-7 feet tall, with a very robust stem, and these leaves that kind of cover everything. Its upright growth habit and the strength of that stalk also supports the beans that are going to use it to climb up. The beans likewise are very important. A scarlet runner bean, as I mentioned, often used in systems like this. The beans, because they're legumes, they add nitrogen to the cropping system. The leaves and stems and even the roots that are turned back into the soil after harvest have not huge amounts of nitrogen, but a significant amount that adds to the entire system. But the beans are critically important because the bean seeds actually have very large amounts of protein, and the amino acids in those in the beans actually complement the amino acids in corn. Neither beans nor corn have a full complement. They're not complete proteins, but they actually balance each other in terms of the ones where they're weak and strong. Now, pumpkins, you may smile at the idea of pumpkins. We think about pumpkins as, jack-o'-lanterns or maybe pumpkin pie, and it's hard to kind of take them seriously as part of a cropping system, particularly one that's used by subsistence farmers. In other words, they were not selling the pumpkins for jack-o'-lanterns to make cash, right? So these pumpkins had to be an important, they had to serve an important function in their cropping system and in their diet. So the pumpkins actually do have quite a few calories and some very important vitamins and minerals, particularly vitamin A. You see their bright orange color indicates lots of vitamin A. Also within the pumpkin are seeds that are very high in both oils and protein. And then finally, their low, aggressive growth habit makes them very valuable in the cropping system because they suppress weeds and are able to capture resources that aren't used by the beans or the corn. A lot of times, though, when we think about the three sisters, it's kind of a charming, delightful system, but farmers are always interested in, well, how productive was it? It's great that, all these nice little characteristics come together, but can you actually, is this a serious cropping system? Can people actually, harvest reasonable amounts of crops? Well, we have quite a bit of information from the historical record, and one of the first that I found from 1687 is by a French guy, de Nanville. If you remember your world history, you know that France and England were at war for what seems like hundreds of years during the colonial period, and they were fighting in Europe, and when they came to North America, they continued fighting here, and they were both trying to be the ones that were going to be in charge of North America, the ones that would be the dominant empire. Well, of course, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois were already here, considered this land to be theirs, and they had quite a bit to say and do in terms of the English and the French fighting over which of them was going to control. Well, for the most part, and through much of history, before the establishment of the United States, the Haudenosaunee sided with Great Britain because Great Britain recognized and acknowledged their land base, and they more or less, not completely, but they respected their borders. So for much of the fighting between France and England, the Haudenosaunee provided corn to England's troops. So this guy de Nonville is sent by his superiors in France to come down right into Haudenosaunee territory. Actually came right down to, if you know where Rochester is in New York State, just a little south of Rochester, it came into that area, Ganondigan, with a very large army. And he claimed in letters back to his superiors that in a period of about 9 days, he destroyed more than 1 million bushel of both standing corn and stored corn. And you can see this quote here, the quantity of corn which we found in store in this place and destroyed by fire is incredible. We also have, from about 100 years later, during the Sullivan campaign, once again, the Haudenosaunee are now caught between warring parties of the American revolutionaries on one side and Great Britain on the other. And once again, for the most part, 4 out of the 6 Haudenosaunee nations supported Great Britain because they respected Haudenosaunee sovereignty, land boundaries. And so they were once again helping Great Britain in their fight against the American revolutionaries. George Washington in 1779 sent a couple of his generals, this one, John Sullivan, right up into Haudenosaunee territory again. They came right up through Pennsylvania, up into southern part of New York, right up into Ithaca, and went up both sides of Cayuga Lake, and then moved farther west. Over the space of about 6 weeks, they destroyed more than 40 Haudenosaunee villages, predominantly Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and destroyed corn and villages, and basically, I mean, today we would call it ethnic cleansing. They drove everybody out and they burned their cornfields and all of the rest. It was a very, very difficult and sad time for the Haudenosaunee. But one of the things to come out of it is we have journals. A lot of the officers in Sullivan's army kept journals, and they give these very incredible descriptions of the agriculture that they saw here in 1779. They came in August, right? So the crops were in full bloom, right? And we see these quotes, destroyed about 150 acres of the best corn I ever saw. Corn grows as cannot be equaled in Jersey, New Jersey. In such quantities would be almost incredible to civilized people. And I should say that almost all of these officers were likely farmers themselves, right? So they knew agriculture, they knew corn, right? And finally, this last, I mean, I could give you 8 or 10 of these journal entries, but they found 200 acres of exceedingly good corn intermixed with beans and squashes and pumpkins and a few potatoes. So we get this picture of an incredibly productive agriculture, and it's extensive. I mean, 200 acres of farmland right in central New York, all done by hand, right? And almost exclusively by women, right? Well, as an agronomist, I like to read these journal entries, but I want some hard numbers. And I was really concerned about, well, what were the yields really, right? I mean, what kind of numbers? What were the bushels per acre? So back in the 1990s, I started doing some field research between 93 and 97 at 2 sites. The Cayuga one is in this nice band of alpha sols up at the Musgrave Research Farm, and our some of our best agricultural land in New York State. And the other one was outside in the southern tier at not so great. It was on a private farm and the soil's not so great. We used a maize variety, an open pollinated variety, still grown in Iroquois communities, Haudenosaunee communities all over New York and up in Canada and even out in Wisconsin. It's an open pollinated variety that is very similar to what would have been grown in New York in the 1700s, maybe 1600s, even 1800s, right? So, and we tried to use practices that would have been similar to what the Iroquois, how they would have grown their corn. Well, I'm going to just show you a couple of slides looking first just at maize yields. And this is a very robust data set. There's hardly anybody, in fact, I don't know anybody, any place in the country that has such a large and robust data set. We had 2 sites, 2 years, replicated, lots of treatments. And so we have, 30, 40 samples for each one of these, data points. So I have a great deal of confidence that these numbers are solid. This is what you can get when you grow this corn, right? It's open pollinated. And if you look at the bushels per acre compared to contemporary hybrids, this is not terrific. In our good soils in Cayuga County, we're talking, kind of 55 up to about 70 bushels per acre. In Tompkins County, the poorer soils, shorter growing season, we're talking, kind of 35 to 45 bushels per acre. But I want to tell you that the time we were doing this research, anthropologists and archaeologists were claiming that indigenous farmers in North America would have had corn yields between 12 and 15 bushels per acre. Now, one of the reasons I did this experiment was that I knew that they were wrong, right? And I wanted some solid data to show them. There's a lot of anthropologists who wouldn't know a corn plant if it was growing in their front yard. And it really made me mad that they were, dissing my Iroquois relatives as being bad corn growers. We're not. We were very good corn growers. All right, but we grew this corn not only as a monoculture, but as a Three Sisters. And I want to spend some time now talking about this, particularly from food value, right? So this is from Tompkins County. And remember, Tompkins County is where things aren't so great, right? The soils aren't great. The growing season is shorter. The corn didn't grow so well, but we grew not only corn as a monoculture right here, but we grew it as the Three Sisters, a polyculture, right? And we also had a bean monoculture and a pumpkin monoculture. So you see that when we look at the total crop yields, you might first think to yourself, well, why don't you grow pumpkin, right? I mean, look at the yield of that pumpkin, right? Well, let's go over and look at Cayuga County. These are the good soils, right? We had terrible drought conditions at a critical time actually, I think in both of those years. And the pumpkin did terribly, regardless of whether it was pumpkin as a monoculture or pumpkin in the Three Sisters. And even the beans didn't do so great. You'll see that the corn monoculture and the corn in the Three Sisters, pretty similar. So this is all kind of, fascinating, right? Because we can now begin to talk a little bit from crop yields to food yields. I've given a lot of workshops. I've got 3, well, they're all grown children now, but all came up through the, Ithaca City School District. And I got dragged into more 4th grade classrooms to talk about Iroquois agriculture in the Three Sisters. And we would put on workshops and do all sorts of wonderful things. And some little kid would always come up to me at the end and say to me, grabbing my arm, but what did they really eat? Because the little kids, and maybe even you, are thinking corn, sweet corn, green beans, and pumpkin. And it really doesn't sound like a terribly balanced diet or one that you could live very long on. And so, yes, I mean, there is a question here. Corn is corn is corn? No. Corn that often kids are thinking is sweet corn, and this is what it looks like in the field. This is what it looks like when you harvest it. Notice the green leaves, the green husks, and the kernels, of course, are soft, right? And of course, very different from field corn, which, you know, is kind of brown when it's harvest time, brown husks. The cobs, the ears look very much different. Those kernels are hard. And the product that you get is grain corn, right? Very, very different. Well, the same thing is true of beans. Yep, you can, these are, you know, kidney beans, and you can harvest them green, and the leaves are green and the pods are green. And you look inside and you see these little tiny seeds. The pod is still there, green beans. But if you wait a couple months, maybe a month, you get a bean plant. This is the same plant, it's just later in the season. The leaves are mostly brown, the stems are brown, the pod's brown, and now that pod, those little tiny seeds are grown into big seeds, right? Well, you're probably saying, well, what's this all about? Well, the food value, the nutritional content of corn and beans depends a whole lot on when it's harvested, right? Now, I know that sweet corn and grain corn are different varieties, different types, right? But we harvest sweet corn when it's immature, right? And it, at that time, has very large amounts of water in it, right? Whereas we harvest corn grain when we're down to about 10% water. And if we look at the amount of energy, calories contained in sweet corn compared to what's in field corn and corn grain, I mean, the difference is stunning, right? The protein, 3 times higher in grain corn as opposed to sweet corn. So if you're a subsistence farmer, of course, most of the corn that you're going to plant and harvest is going to be corn grain, right? Because this is just too valuable of a food to harvest it when it's immature and to lose all of that energy and all of that protein. Now, beans, the same thing is true. You harvest green beans, they're mostly water, 90% water. There's only 31 calories and only 2 grams of protein. But you wait several weeks till it dries down and you get a kidney bean. Now you've only got 12% water and you've got a huge amount of calories, almost the same that you get in corn grain. But look at the protein, enormous amounts of protein. And so this is why farmers plant corn and beans, right? They plant corn and beans to get all of this protein, particularly with the beans, and all of this energy with the corn. So we can think about crop yields, which is the marketable weight per unit area of land, like pounds per acre or bushels per acre. But we can also think about food yields as the amount of energy and protein produced in that unit area of land, either as calories per acre or as kilograms of protein per acre. So if we want to stop thinking about crop yields and talk about food yields, we have to make a couple of calculations. We first have to find out how much energy, how many calories are in a kilogram or a pound of maize, how much in bean, how much in pumpkin, and then I've added another category here, the pumpkin seed, because after doing this research and running a lot of these calculations, I realized that the pumpkin seed turns out to be an incredibly important food source. All right, so with maize, we have 3,600 calories per kilogram. We get 94 grams of protein. And that's because there's not much water in a kilogram of maize grain. If we look at beans, it's kind of similar for calories, 3,370, but a huge amount of protein, 225 grams. and a little bit more water. Pumpkin flesh, not much, 260 calories, right? Because most of the pumpkin is water, right? So that's why when we had those weights with the three sisters, there was a huge amount in that pumpkin column, but it's mostly water, and you can't eat water, right? It doesn't have calories, it doesn't have energy, it doesn't have protein. But pumpkin seed, huge amount of calories because it's mostly oils, fats, right? It also has very large amounts of protein and very little water. All right, so we go back and look at these crop yields, right? And I didn't have the pumpkin seed in the first one, but we go back once again and look at these comparisons with the three sisters, with a monoculture maize, a bean monoculture, and a pumpkin monoculture that contains the seeds as well. The straight crop yields, just how much do these things weigh, right? And now we go and ask, well, what about their food yields? How, sorry, did I just go back? Wait a minute, I got a little mixed up here, right? Yes. So what we're going to do is multiply those crop yields by their contents of the energy and protein, right? So we know that every kilogram of corn maize grain has, I think, 3,600 calories, right? We make all those calculations out, right? And so now we have a picture that shows how much energy or food value is in this system. This is the maize monoculture, right? It has a huge amount of calories, right? It yields well, and it's got a lot of calories in every pound or every bushel, right? This is the pumpkin monoculture, and notice that big bar, it's all come down, right? Because most of that pumpkin flesh was actually water. There are some calories in there, and there's a lot of calories in the pumpkin seed. The bean monoculture, lots of calories, right? But we didn't have much yield, so it comes way down. Look at the three sisters. Even though the three sisters is planted with the bean and the pumpkin, it's not hurting its food yield, its energy yields at all. In fact, we see an increase over the maize monoculture, and certainly an increase over the beans and pumpkin. So that's the energy yields. Protein shows us something very similar. The maize monoculture's not so great on protein, but really still pretty darn good, right? Huge amount of protein because we're growing so much corn. It's an incomplete protein, but still a lot there. Pumpkin, most of its protein is coming, not most, but a large portion of it is coming from that pumpkin seed. The bean, doing pretty well. It's got lots of protein. Yield is not great, but we're still doing pretty good. The three sisters outperforms everybody, right, in protein, because it gets the contributions from the the pumpkin seed, the pumpkin flesh, the beans, and the corn. So we have all of this protein much better than anything else, right? So maybe I've persuaded you at this point. You're going to grow the three sisters. Don't grow maize monoculture, don't grow bean monoculture, don't grow pumpkin monoculture. But that is actually a pretty unrealistic comparison, because if you're a farmer and you've got a field, say you've got a 1 acre field, and you're thinking, what am I going to plant this year? And you're thinking, well, I'm really not going to do that three sisters. I want to plant monocultures. But you're not going to plant the entire field to a monoculture. You're not going to say, I'm going to have the three sisters, or I'm going to have beans, or I'm going to have just pumpkin, or I'm going to just have corn. You're really going to think about what I would call monoculture mixtures, right? In other words, you're going to have your 1 acre field, and you might decide to plant 1/3 of it to corn, 1/3 of it to bean, and 1/3 of it to pumpkin. But if you're a smart farmer, you might think, you know, I know the corn yields better than anything else. I think I need more of my field in corn. So you plant half of it to corn, a quarter of it to pumpkin and a quarter of it to bean, right? And then, you think a little bit more and you say, really, I'm going to put 80% of it into corn. I'm not going to risk not having enough to eat, and just 10% to bean and 10% to pumpkin, right? So if we make those kinds of comparisons and look at how much energy we get, the last one over here is the Three Sisters, right? So we compare it first with, suppose I planted the field 1/3 pumpkin, 1/3 bean, and 1/3 corn. This is what we lose in terms of energy. It's half of the energy that we get from the Three Sisters. So we say, well, I'm going to plant half of it to corn, right? Well, we do better, right? We get up something more, but it's still nothing compared to our Three Sisters. If we go 80% to corn and just 10 to pumpkin and 10 to beans, we do better. And if we planted it all to corn, we would get this, right? What this tells us is that corn is so important in this cropping system, right? You cannot afford to leave out corn. And in fact, the wonder of the Three Sisters is that even when you add other crops in the same field to it, you still manage to maintain your yields, and you still get an increase in total energy. And if you look at the story from protein, the same thing holds true, but the advantage of the Three Sisters for protein is even greater than it is for any of these others, and greater than it is for corn monoculture, right? So this, I think, gives you a sense of why the Three Sisters, with corn as the kind of anchor of the system, and why so many farmers all over the world still use a cropping system like this. It kind of, it makes me feel wonderful about corn, right? I love this data because corn just, kind of shines through. So here are the conclusions: that intercropped maize, bean, and pumpkin was a highly productive cropping system that largely satisfied Haudenosaunee dietary needs. That maize is the anchor of the system because of its ability to produce very large amounts of energy and an awful lot of protein. And the Three Sisters provides more energy and protein than individual crop monocultures and more than monoculture mixtures of these crops. So I will end there.
Wow, Jane, that was really great. Thank you so much.
I know it was a lot, and
No, it was everybody's
a lot of graphs. I hope that I didn't go too fast. But
no,
I had to leave time for Margaret.
I know. Well, we do have a couple of questions. Yep, and people are saying your presentation skills are still great.
Oh, great! I'm so glad I haven't lost too much, huh?
There were a couple of questions here. I'm going to call folks out. Hopefully, the individual from Go Farm Hawaii, I don't know your name, but you had a couple of questions. I didn't know if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask Jane those, or I definitely can ask them for you. Jay, did you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Hold on, sweetie. Yes. Hi. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. One was, I was wondering if there's any evidence of there being other crops that are grown in the system, like happens in milpa systems, whether they're like planted or kind of more like weedy greens, and have been reading recently the book Feeding Cahokia, talking about some sort of pre-maize cultigens, and wonder if there's archaeological evidence for those up in the Northeast at all.
We don't see much of those in New York. In other parts of the Northeast, yes, and certainly along the Atlantic, seaboard, right? Those Chenopodiums and Maygrass, and I'm trying to think of the other names. Gail Fritz, who wrote that book, is a good friend and colleague. We don't see that in New York, but Cahokia has taken place several hundred years before the Confederacy kind of gets up and going, right? And by that time, in 1400, 1500 in New York, corn was pretty dominant, right? Whereas in the Cahokian times, when it was at its flowering, these other crops were much more in use, and corn was relatively unimportant. So lots of other plants were used in Haudenosaunee territories and communities. Many of them gathered, right? So lots of herbs, berries, nuts and seeds, but not so explicitly planted. There may have been weeds or plants that we would call weedy plants that they, seasonally harvested from cornfields, but not much. I haven't seen much in the document, history that describes that. So.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jay. Are you joining us from Hawaii? It looks green there. Yeah, that's nice. Can you show
I thought it was Ithaca.
I'm like, show us a little more of that greenery. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. So I don't see any other questions. There were certainly some comments, definitely about some of the slides you were showing, Jane, and the hairdos of the time of the kernels and the.
Oh, right, yes.
That was pretty great. I just want to remind folks that so many resources, that Margaret provided and Jane and all the other speakers are posted on the online course site. And if you're having any trouble getting into that, make sure you reach out, because, there's videos and like historical documents that everybody's provided that are really great. We didn't want to print them all and put them in everybody's boxes, but they're up there and they're really wonderful. So hopefully you get a chance to get onto the online site and enjoy some of the materials up there as well. So with that, Margaret, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, and thanks, Jane. That was a great introduction to the three sisters. I am going to attempt to share my screen. And what I would really like to start with, because I think it's most appropriate following on Jane's history of the interactions between the Haudenosaunee people and others who cultivated corn, and most appropriate given that we're talking about a crop that is really truly indigenous to the Americas. I just want to acknowledge Cornell University, particularly the fact that our Ithaca campus is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayagono, or the Cayuga Nation, which is a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy obviously precedes the establishment of Cornell University, of New York State, and of the United States of America. And so I just want to acknowledge the painful history of Gayagono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayagono people, past and present, to the lands and the waters that we see around us. We owe a debt in many ways, and as a corn breeder, I always feel that debt very strongly. I've worked a little with Jane and with the local indigenous people, and I've worked a lot in Mexico and Central America, which is one of the birthplaces of corn. And we owe the debt of gratitude to the native peoples in all of those areas for having developed this phenomenal crop that Jane just sung the praises of. So my piece of this presentation is going to be really about farmer seed selection and corn diversity. So what I want to talk about is farmers' influence on corn, both through the domestication process and through seed selection, and then a little bit about the wealth of diversity we find in the corn crop. So I want to start with the result of farmer seed selection, which was really domestication. So this slide has a kind of a mix of pictures of the ancestor of corn, Teosinte. And you can see this picture on the bottom left shows a Mexican cornfield. This is the corn right here. And then you see this very corn-like looking plant here. This is actually Teosinte. which is the wild ancestor of our domesticated corn. In the center bottom picture here, there's the penny. There's some typical US Dent corn. This is a flower corn, a large kernel flower corn. And these little tiny black things here are the seeds of the Teosinte. They would, you can see one right here in the bottom right. They occur in these little, what look like little tiny cobs in a way with husks on them, but you can see them here. They're like multi-part flowers that have a little set of seeds. This picture in the center is an example, a Teosinte head on top of a poppy blue ear of corn. And over here, you see the Teosinte on the right, the corn on the left. So my point with this is to note that, number one, whoever thought this was a good thing to eat, these little tiny black seeds would fall on the ground when they were mature. So you had to try and gather little black seeds from the ground. They had a seed coat that was indigestible unless you cracked it open. So if you just pop them in your mouth as whole seeds, you get nothing from them. You just deposit them out the other end with a big pile of fertilizer. But if you crack them open and grind them, you could get some nutrition from them. But I always marvel that somewhere in our ancient history, Native peoples realized that this was potentially a good source of food and began to select variants of it that had seeds without that really hard seed coat on them, that the seeds, instead of falling apart from this little seed head, they stayed stuck to it, and eventually developed what we know as modern corn. Those original farmers, without any knowledge of genetics or breeding techniques or any of that other stuff we all take for granted now, did most of the hard work domesticating corn. At this moment, so that's my scientist humility. I think we need now also a little level of humility as humans. I always like to ask people, well, really, who domesticated who? And we think about this because corn can't survive in nature. After all, the seeds are completely digestible. They have no form of defense against animals or birds, things that want to consume them. They stick to that cob. So when the cob is mature, they all fall down on the ground. They have no obvious mechanism for dispersal. Poor crop can't survive in nature. But then I always like to turn that around and say, can you? And I would like to note that really this is a history of coevolution. Corn has evolved quite elaborate mechanisms to take excellent advantage of dispersal by us. Think about it this way. We save the seeds. We carefully put them away somewhere so nothing steals them, eats them, rots them, or consumes them. We provide a nice land bed, mounded or otherwise, where we prepare the ground, we control the weeds to avoid the competition. We protect it from insects and diseases in a whole array of ways. We scare off the birds and the mammals that might otherwise want to eat it. This crop has really trained us well. We do its job for dispersal like nobody else. So really, corn and humans is a story of coevolution, not a story of us domesticating the corn, but maybe a story of the corn adapting to take great advantage of us as preservers and dispersal agents. Well, subsequent to domestication, there's also been a huge amount of farmer selection to develop a multitude of types of corn. The picture in the bottom right here is just a shot of a bunch of ears I happen to have laying around. Up in the top center there, that's the little head of Teosinte. You can see that different peoples in different parts of the world selected a whole array of distinct types of corn. They varied in kernel texture, kernel color, the shape of the ears, the amount of husk cover, and of course, also the flavor and the eating quality. And that's one of the things I want to come back to and talk a bit more about. First, I would like to touch on an interesting example of seed selection. This was a study done by one of my former graduate students in the Sierra de Santa Marta in Mexico, which is this beautiful area you see on the bottom right, a traditional corn cultivating region from the area in which we believe corn was originally domesticated. And they were studying current day farmers' seed selection practices. And I want to talk about this because I think it illuminates some of the interesting things that we now can do if we want to do some of our own seed selecting. So they did a survey and they asked all the participants, do you select maize seed? And when they surveyed men and women, the men all answered yes. And the women mostly, almost all, answered no. That was interesting. The student of mine was really interested in gendered roles in seed selection. And so she pursued that with a subsequent question. Do you set aside maize for seed? And to this, the women all answered yes. And I think what that tells us is that selection, that word in Spanish, was seen as choosing plants to harvest for seed from the field and choosing ears from the pile that had been set aside for seed. But when women prepare seed every day, day in and day out, grain for food, they're always setting aside what they perceive to be the best ears during that food preparation process. So as the grain is being shelled or ground or cooked or made into tortillas, they're setting aside the types that they thought were the best. So what this tells you is that the women are exercising selection pressure. The ears that make the best food have genes that make them better for food production or food quality or shelling or whatever else the traits might be. And therefore, they're influencing the genetics of what gets planted the next year. And it's that process of choosing subsets of the genes in this mix that is an open pollinated corn that brings about genetic change, that tailors the corn to the characteristics you want. As breeders, I can say this because I'm a sort of a classical corn breeder. You know, I grow my corn in a breeding nursery and select for what I think is important. There are often traits that get overlooked. And these are some of the traits that farmer selection really emphasized. Some of it is about the situation in the field. Jane gave you a great introduction to how corn was part of the Three Sisters here in the Northeast, in Mexico and Central America. As one of our questionnaires pointed out, it was part of the milpa system, but often again grown in association with a climbing bean, or in this case, in the highlands of Mexico, you can see it in association with this bean, which is a fava bean, and also the quelites, or the little vegetables that were grown underneath. So when you're selecting corn seed in a cropping system that doesn't include those associated crops, you're not going to necessarily get the plants that are best tailored to work in coordination with the other crops that are part of the mixture. So farmer seed selection emphasizes the crop mixtures that farmers are actually using and ensures that the crop is tailored to work well with those crop mixtures. As I alluded to earlier, farmer seed selection and processor seed selection also emphasizes traits like how easy the corn is to shell, or how well it makes the foods that are needed for any given culture or any different culinary use you might find. So those are some of the traits that farmer seed selection over hundreds and hundreds of years has really focused on, and how it's ended up creating that tremendous array of diversity that I just talked about. So the results, all sorts of different types, different cultures in different places wanted different colors, different textures, different ear shapes, and different kernel sizes. And so we end up with this huge array of diversity that is current day cultivated maize. One of my colleagues here, who's much more of a high-powered geneticist than I am, has studied the overall genomics, the genetic structure of corn as a whole crop, as a whole collection of different varieties. And his stock statement is, if you pick 2 different ears of corn at random from that overall collection, those 2 ears of corn are going to be more different one from another at the genetic level than humans are from chimpanzees. So the genetic diversity just within corn is greater than the difference between us and the chimpanzee. It's kind of striking. So I think in that way, corn is a marvelous staple, the heart of the Three Sisters system, but also a marvelous staple for the diversity it provides and the many options to tailor it to unique places and unique uses. So farmer seed selection over time, it really created things that produce more grain. So the amount produced was almost always important to farmers. And Jane highlighted that a number of times in terms of the productivity of the Three Sisters system. Farmers in different parts of the world also selected corn for adaptation to an enormous array of environments. Everything from here in central Mexico, the home of corn probably, to the highlands in Central America and South America, to the lowlands and the intercrops with beans. As corn moved around the world, we had selection to environments in Africa and environments in Asia, and eventually even the central part of the United States, Corn Belt. Right? So corn was adapted to an enormous array of altitudes, latitudes, and climates. an enormous array of end uses in terms of colors, grain types, and flavors. So there's a little bit about the diversity we created. We had a piece in the box that went out, I believe, about kernel textures. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about corn kernel textures. And I think there was a nice description in there that kind of looked like this picture at the top that talked about the different types of endosperm. So corn endosperm, you can have the hard, what we call the corn, very hard. There's also soft endosperm, and there's a sugary kind that is basically the sugars that are originally in a sweet corn that don't get converted into one or another of these endosperm starch types, the hard or the soft. So popcorn, the one on the left here, tends to have very small kernels with extremely hard endosperm and a very hard seed coat. That seed coat is really hard because what you want a popcorn to do is to hold in that endosperm as it's heated. The endosperm does have lots of little air pockets. So as you heat it, that air begins to expand and you have this very hard seed coat, which holds it in until there's really a lot of pressure inside there. And when that pressure finally blows, it basically blows that kernel inside out and you have a popcorn. Flint corn tends to have somewhat larger kernels, not quite as hard as seed coat. If you heated this like you would heat a popcorn, it'll pop, but it'll just kind of split open and poof out a little bit. It won't turn itself inside out, but it's still all that hard endosperm. The flour corns, I'll skip over to that, are all soft endosperm. And so that as that dries, it just kind of shrinks uniformly and you get these big round floury kernels. Whereas dent corns are a mix. The hard endosperm retains this kind of hard cup shape as it dries, but as the soft endosperm dries, it shrinks. So you get this dent in the top, which gives us the dent corns. So you can see here's the middle's the dent corn. This is a flour corn, the big rounded chalky looking kernels. The flint corns also have rounded kernels, but they tend to be kind of shiny and translucent because that flinty endosperm is a little bit see-through. And then the popcorns tend to be small and very hard kernels. And I stuck some seed of sweet corn over there. It looks pretty awful when it's dried because it's just all shrunken down because there's no real starchy structure to keep it from just collapsing in on itself. So there's some images of the different kernel types of corn. In the Northeast, the most typical heritage corns were predominantly these flint types. They tend to be very long ears, 8 to 10 kernel rows, a rather thick cob compared to the amount of kernels, fairly early maturing. And they also tend to tiller a lot. So you often could get more than one ear on a given plant. And that helped productivity. It gave you more ears per seed planted. And, you know, as Jane was talking about, these were hand planted corn systems. So, you know, fewer seeds to plant and more ears per seed was a good thing if you were doing that all by hand. So these tend to be our heritage corns. I want to throw out a call out to another book that Jane wrote. I don't think this was the one that was in your packet, but it's another great one, Traditional Iroquois Corn, Its History, Cultivation, and Use. So I would refer you to that one as well as a really good history of the corns that were traditional in this area. I also want to take a moment, and these may look like little diversions, side roads on my topic here, but I think they're germane because they help illustrate what some of the pluses and challenges are to working with open pollinated varieties. These corns we've been talking about all along are open pollinated varieties, and I find people are often confused about what's really the difference between open pollinated and hybrid varieties. So I'll take a moment to talk about that. An open pollinated variety, like the name suggests, it means the pollen source is uncontrolled. So it's pollinated by whatever pollen is present in the field where the corn is grown. So you can think about this as saving an ear from a corn plant, shelling the seeds off it, planting those seeds out in a field, and then allowing them to mix one with another, pollen from one plant, pollinating the ear from another plant, and then saving the seed from that again, generation after generation. You can see how choosing which seeds, which ears you save and which seeds you plant will change the genetic nature of this open pollinated variety. If you pick only the ones that have white seed, and those are the only ones you plant in your field, pretty much everything you have out there is going to be white the next season. and you're going to be able to bring about a change. You could eliminate other colors from your variety by selecting in that way. White's a nice example because that's the easy one to work towards. If you want to work towards something that's purely red or purely yellow, it's a little more challenging for genetic reasons I won't go into. But that's the nature of the open pollinated variety. Open pollinated varieties, this is an example of one called Painted Mountain that was selected for really short season traits, and it's actually adapted to Montana. It doesn't do very well here because we have too much, believe it or not, too much heat and too long a growing season, but it's a beautiful corn. Every plant in an open pollinated variety is a different hybrid. So every plant is a cross between two different parents. The pollen probably came from something else in the field and pollinated the silks of the plant that the ear came from. But each kernel on that ear was probably pollinated by a different pollen grain from somewhere around that field. So each plant in the open pollinated variety you can think of as itself a hybrid, but this hybrid is different from that one and from that one and from that one. They're each slightly genetically distinct. You can save the seed out of this mix, and as I said, create change in it, bring about change through selection of that seed. And choosing which seed to save will eventually alter that variety in such a way that it's adapted to whatever you're selecting it for. A hybrid, on the other hand, the seed of a hybrid is the product of a cross between two distinct but fixed parent lines. So we call these inbreds. So the plants grown from the seed of a cross between two distinct parents that are fixed in their genetic nature. So this ear you harvest here, all the pollen came from this parent, all the silks came from that parent. The cross between those two gives you single cross hybrid seed. So when you save that seed and sell it to a farmer, that's what will be planted by the farmer. That gives you hybrid seed. And in a hybrid, you've all driven around and seen those fields where every single tassel looks the same and they're all at the same height and the ears are all at the same height and they all look identical. That's the single cross hybrid. Every plant is a cross between two different parents, just like in the open pollinated variety. But in the hybrid, every plant is exactly the same cross. The parents of every single one are exactly the same two different parents. So the progeny, like identical twins, all look exactly the same. Hybrids often have better vigor in terms of size, maturity, and yields than the parents from which they were produced. And this is what that looks like. So on the left in the upper panel here, you see the two inbred parents, and this is their hybrid progeny, the hybrid seed that results from them. These are the ears from two inbred parents. And if you cross those two, these are the ears you get on the hybrid. So you can see why people were kind of excited about hybrid vigor here. Hybrids can be highly productive. However, you can't save the seed of this hybrid and have it breed true. What you will end up with if you save seed from a hybrid is a mix of things that look like these two inbred parents and maybe a little more vigorous and a little less vigorous and mixes between those two, but it will be nowhere near as productive as the original F1 hybrid. So that's one of the key differences between open pollinated varieties and hybrids. You can save seed and gradually change the nature of an open pollinated variety. For a hybrid, you're going to want to go back if you want to get that productivity. You need to go back and purchase that seed anew every season because it has to be that controlled cross between those two specific distinct parents. So the last thing I want to talk about here is what does it take to select and save your own open pollinated variety seed? So the first point to make, I talked about how open pollinated varieties can be quite variable because each ear is a hybrid, but each ear may be a slightly different hybrid from the other ones. So what ears you pick is going to determine the genetics that continue in your variety. So you do want to choose carefully what's most useful to you, what's most desirable, what grows the best. So that choice will make a difference to the genetics in the next generation and down the road. You have to save at least 100 years. If you just look and say, oh, this is the perfect year, this is the epitome of my variety. It has great appearance, it has great productivity, it looks like it'll taste great. I tested half the kernels and they have wonderful flavor qualities and they shell really easily. If you save only 1 year, by the time you get to the next generation or two, that thing is going to look awful because you're going to have inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression is just the emergence of really undesirable traits because you don't have enough genetic variation in there. It's actually the same thing that happened when, like in the British royal families, when all of the married relatives within the family, because you had to keep it all within the family, and suddenly you had people emerging that had a very high incidence of things like, oh good heavens, what's that disorder where you can't stop bleeding?
Hemophilia.
You know, hemophilia, thank you, of hemophilia, and of people who had what was called at that time idiocy, like they were not very smart, they were colorblind. All of these are traits that when you breed too closely within a close family, those are negative traits that you begin to see in higher and higher frequency. The same thing will happen with your corn if you don't save enough ears to maintain a fairly good level of diversity. So if you don't save at least 100 ears, you're going to see some inbreeding depression, and that would be just negative traits emerging. You want to identify the best plants before harvest, because otherwise, you know, the ears that look nicest are likely to come from the plants that accidentally didn't have any competition around them, or the plants that accidentally were in the place where the manure spreader stuck and dropped a giant pile of manure. So they're likely to be good because of environmental reasons rather than genetic reasons. So you want to look in the field before you harvest and maybe mark plants that have competition around them, but even so, they're healthy, they're standing, and they look good. From those, then you want to choose the best and the healthiest ears that came from those good plants in the field. You need to carefully dry the ears. It's worth knowing that any temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit will kill seed, so you can't dry them hot. You want the seed moisture to be low to keep away all these nasty molds. If you have any molds in your seed, you really have a mess on your hands. It rots very quickly. Those molds grow, they generate heat when they're growing, so then your seed can get too hot. They continue to mold more seed beyond just the part that was already moldy. So you want to get rid of all that stuff. You have to shell it and clean it. And you have to store it away from humidity, heat, and pests. So remember, these are all the things that as humans who corn co-evolved to live with, these are the responsibilities we have to the crop in saving its seed. It's also always a good idea to test the germination, and you can even do this yourself. Just put 100 seeds with a wet paper towel and see how many grow, and to look at the purity. You want to make sure you don't have too much other junk in there. It's good to avoid sowing dead seed, and it's really good to avoid sowing weed seeds with your crop. So even, you know, doing your own evaluation of purity and of germination can be a good idea. And I will note at the end that producing clean, healthy, and high quality seed is definitely more complicated and much more labor intensive than producing a really nice grain crop for all the reasons I just mentioned. So this is not an exercise for the chronically overworked and, you know, people with not enough time on their hands, which probably is most of us, or, you know, if you don't want to dedicate some time and effort to doing this carefully, you can end up with a bit of a mess on your hands in return for a lot of invested effort. So to summarize, you know, corn is truly a gem. It has an amazing range of diversity for a huge number of traits. Farmers' seed selection over time has tailored corn to a lot of different environments and a lot of different preferences. And people who are interested in seed saving and seed selecting can continue that process of coevolution between humans and their corn crop. And they can do that by emphasizing traits that are locally important, adaptation to local growing environments and pests, adaptation to intercrops if you're interested, things like the Three Sisters or the Milpa system, and also emphasizing some of the unique uses, types, and flavors that can make corn truly a rich source of dietary interest and a valuable source of dietary nutrition. So with that, I will just say a thank you. And I have my nice corn sunset picture to indicate the end of my part of this talk. And I will stop screen sharing and hope it was interesting, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Margaret. That's great. There are a bunch of questions popping up, and we have a decent amount of time. So if folks want to ask their questions personally, that was, the goal of this program, is to actually hopefully be able to interact a little bit with each other. So I see Adam Nordell. Did you want to pop on and ask a couple of your questions? Oh, there you are, Adam. I can see you now.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you, Jane, for your workshop, and Margaret as well. Those are both really incredible. So really appreciate the opportunity to hear you both speak. My first question was about Teosinte, and the trouble of processing it as a food source with its hull. And I'm curious, it occurred to me that could be related to the development of making nishtamal. And I was wondering if anyone knows about that, whether Teosinte can be nishtamalized and whether that deals with the seed coat.
Now, that's a really interesting question. And as somebody who cut my teeth in Mexico, where there's lots of nixtamalization going on, I should probably know the answer to this. I honestly don't know. I'm not sure that the nixtamalization process would be enough to penetrate that seed coat on Teosinte, but that's a long way of saying I'm not entirely sure. And it's been so long ago. Nixtamalization has, as you would probably know, a very deep cultural history of use from hundreds, thousands of years, and the development of maize, original archaeological maize, goes back 6,000 or 7,000 years. So I think people probably, if they did ever use it on Teosinte, they very quickly stopped once they had something more maize-like, because it was just so much more productive.
Did you have another question too, Adam, or was that was it?
I had a follow-up on, I don't know if, on Azer. I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right,
yeah.
but maybe
Yep.
that person could go first.
Okay, April, I think you're on in Azure.
I'm not sure what April is. We're in different offices.
Oh, okay. All right.
But yeah, thank you for putting this together, Heather. I know what it takes, and you're a trooper. Good job. Quick question for Margaret and maybe even Jane. I'm curious. I mean, I've been following the track of nixtamalization, and I don't know how it make it all. I mean, because we have several tortillerias here in New England, and one which we're gonna be visiting later in the week. So nixtamalization has made it all the way up here in the Northeast, but I wonder how did that happen? Because I don't seem to find any records of nixtamalization. Maybe Johnny cakes or something like that, but no nixtamalization in this area. So you guys have any theories or maybe something to enlighten me there?
I mean, I can tell you that Haudenosaunee people use nixtamalized corn to make corn soup. And that's been the corn soup has probably been made for hundreds of years, uses wood ash, right? And I don't know if they learned it from people farther south or if it happened by accident, but certainly corn is nixtamalized in Iroquois communities. Not always, right? Because there's a lot of corn is often ground that has not been nixtamalized. But when you make corn soup, you nixtamalize it, right? You boil the corn kernels with wood ash, and that is the nixtamalizing ingredient.
Yeah, maybe there's some sort of, I mean, there is coevolution between corn and people. I wonder if the techniques that you use for cooking are also part of that coevolution.
Yeah, I mean, but here it was wood ash, and in Mexico, what is? I thought it was like lime in Mexico.
It depends. I think it depends on the area. I mean, I've been on the Oaxaca region, and there they have mountains of lime. So
Right.
of course they'll
Yeah.
use that, but I don't know, in the Yucatan, I think they're either they get some lime that is not local or they use wood ash.
Right, right. Well, in the Northeast, the Iroquois people use wood ash, hardwood ash, right?
Good,
And-
good. I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
I was going to add as well, tomorrow with Frank and Rebecca. Rebecca is going to be talking about making traditional corn soup,
Oh, right, right.
and sifting wood ashes and preparing them to put the corn through the nixtamalization process. And again, if you get on the website as well that Catherine set up, there's Catherine. Thanks, Catherine. She has some really wonderful videos of the traditional process that the Oneida community uses and still uses today. So she'll be talking about that tomorrow during the webinar, which is really exciting. So
Perfect. Thank you.
Randy, he doesn't know how to sort his corn. He's had so everybody got their corn packets, with the different types of corn in it. And he was asking, how do you know? I can let you speak for yourself. Sorry, Randy.
Okay. Well, it's pretty easy for me to do that. You did it. You had a good description of the sweet corn, and the popcorn. We all know what that looks like. So I didn't have a problem there. The dent corn, of course, the name tells it all. But then I'm not in the rest of the samples. I think I'm getting mixed up between flour and flint. I wonder if there's anything in the kernel itself that I can look at to make sure that I can tell them apart.
So I'll try to respond to that. I'm realizing I should have ordered a box from Heather so I could know what you were looking at. So if I'm
here.
Yeah.
Yep, this
she
white
holds up two kernels.
Yeah,
like I can't
white.
see a thing, Heather. I can see Go Farm in Hawaii there. Jay has his kernels out on a cutting board.
Good job,
Yeah.
Jay.
Yeah.
So
Jeez.
here's what I'll tell you. Yeah, I think you should hire him as your assistant, Heather.
Yeah.
So here's what I'll tell you. The flint corn, so looking at the outside of the kernels, flint versus flour, the flint will look kind of shiny and translucent, and the flour will look rather dull and chalky if they're good flints and flours. If you actually take a knife, a really hard knife, and maybe you soak the kernels a little, or maybe you don't, but try to slice through them, okay? You should be able to see again that the inside of the flour corn, wow, look at that. I can almost see that. Yeah. The inside of the flour corn will look very like white and crumbly, whereas the flint is almost, it shatters into these really hard sort of translucent pieces when you try to cut it. So that's the best I can do without having things to actually show you in terms of what they look like.
Okay, I that's helpful. I think I'm getting them. And then the different uses for, flour, that's kind of obvious. But then flint is also used for cornmeal, right? But they're very different in terms of their qualities, right? We're talking a lot more. Well, is it just soft and hard, or is there must be protein differences or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm looking at Jane, hoping, since she talked about protein ad nauseum, I'm hoping she knows something about that. I'm not sure if there are protein differences between flint and flour inherently.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I don't know.
So you now have two experts who don't know but are willing to guess. So I would have guessed the same. But certainly the big difference between them is the way in which they cook or process. So if you throw those kernels into two different corn soups, a flint and a flour, you'll get something pretty different in terms of texture and the nature of the kernels. If you, like in parts of Africa, people pound their corn to make ground up corn that they use for lots of different cooked. It's kind of like grits, the African version of grits. But if you do that with a flint corn, you get little shards, and that cooks up very differently with some texture. But if you do it with a flour corn, it basically disintegrates into like chalk dust. That also cooks up, but it gives you a very different texture. So it's more these differences in how they process for different types of foods. You can't really make real good tortillas from flints. Those tend to be denser flours.
And Margaret, haven't you said that the demarcation between flint and flour is along a continuous spectrum? So, I mean, if you're on the outer edges of it, it's probably very obvious, but as they grade into each other with different proportions of hard and soft, it becomes increasingly difficult to tell the flint from the flour. Is that correct, or am I totally mixing this up?
Now you're remembering, you remember what I said better than I do. So yes, in fact, it's not like you're either completely flint or completely flour or dent. It's not like there are hard, gaps between those. It really is a spectrum, and you can find kernels that fall all over the spectrum. We spend in a breeding nursery, we spend a bunch of time taking notes on things, and I end up writing, okay, this one is flinty, this one is flint dent, this one is dent flour, this one is dent flint. It's like a million gradations, because it really is a spectrum. And what I was saying, Jane is exactly right. So what I was saying is really about the extremes, the thing is completely floury or completely flinty.
It'll be interesting because tomorrow, Frank Kutka will just be really focused on Flint corn. So we'll hear a lot more about that type. And then Rebecca Webster, she's the one that provided the flour corn, which is the white one. I hope I'm not giving that away and everybody's mad now. But so it'll be interesting to hear about this corn. This came from the Oneida community, and a group of individuals in her community grow acres of this white flour corn every year and share it and trade within their community to feed each other. And she provided, just so wonderfully provided, this is very special. And you all have, I think, a pound of it in your box. And she's going to show you how to make this traditional corn soup from this traditional white flour corn. So that was the flour corn. And then, I think everybody can tell the other ones, the Flint corn is the one that has some of the little bit of color in it. Like Margaret said, I think, this Flint has a little bit of dent in it. It's kind of been mixed up out in the field, but you definitely can see it is definitely glossier. And has a little more variation than a lot of the other corn types. Well, there's some more questions here, and I see Sylvia, you had a question. Did you wanna ask?
Yeah, sure, I do. First of all, Jane and Margaret, thanks so much for really fabulous presentations. But my question was that I saw the image of the Teosinte superimposed on that ear of blue corn, and the difference in the two is so striking. And I'm just wondering, is there any archaeological evidence of any of the stages in between? How did we get from the Teosinte to the modern corn varieties? Do we know what that path was, and do we have any evidence of that?
Yeah, I can answer. I'll try to be brief because I know our time's getting short. We absolutely do have a lot of evidence on that. Most of it's archaeological. It turns out corn cobs fossilize pretty well. So you find fossilized corn cobs from thousands of years ago in some of the caves, particularly in the Southwest and into Mexico and Mesoamerica. And, they were much tinier than that Iroquois blue. They had probably 4 rows of kernels around the rows of maybe 10 or 12 kernels around the little tiny cob. So they were much more similar to the Teosinte. So we have that archaeological evidence, and there's a pretty rich fossil record that helps to show the different stages and the progress over time. We also now have key evidence from actual genetics and genes, and there's about 5 critically important, what they call domestication genes, that created a lot of the differences between Teosinte and corn. I mean, you think about them as vastly different in terms of the structure of that ear, but there were a few key traits that regulate how the plant develops that affected a few key genes that regulate how the plant develops that affected a whole array of the traits that really converted a teosinte into a corn.
Great, thank you.
I'll just volunteer. I see all the disagreement about flints and tortillas, and as soon as those words came out of my mouth, I was like, wait a minute. But you know, there are those flint corns that make really bad tortillas, and there are other flints that, so again, it depends on the variety. A lot of it depends on the variety. So I don't disagree with anybody who's fighting and disagreeing about whether flints make tortillas.
Ah, that's great. Thanks, Margaret. There is one last question about waxy corn. Is sometimes considered, let's see, I can't see who asked this question. My screen isn't.
I think it was Lauren.
Oh,
Lauren McDonough.
Oh, okay. Lauren, did you want to?
Sure. Let me turn on my video. Hold on.
I like the
So
ad.
we often say there's 6 types of corn, and the 6th type is waxy corn. We're at a corn mill. We're just wondering, like, what's up with it? Which is a very non-question, I know. But you know, like, why? Where did it develop? Like, do we know anything about it? We know it popped up in China, but that's all we know.
Yeah, so we actually know a lot about waxy corn, and it's one I didn't include it on my different textures because it's really still a pretty niche type. It's been pretty popular over time in several different Asian cultures. And what waxy corn is it has the endosperm, the starchy part of the kernel that we've been talking about with the flints and the dents and so on. It has a different type of starch. So there are several different types of starch you find in endosperm, and the waxy corn just has a really different one that gives it a texture that is quite distinct from flint or dent. And so you find it used in places where people make some really different sorts of food products. You know, again, it comes back to my thing about different cultures finding variation and focusing in on variants that were uniquely appealing to them in the particular food products they make. And waxy corn is a product of one of those. It's a later addition only in the sense that it took folks here in North America a long time to recognize that it was being used and was a distinct type and had interesting characteristics. So it's been around for a long time.
Great. Well, that was so much fun. Thank you, Margaret and Jane. It was really great, very informative, and thanks everyone for your great questions. I really appreciate those. I do realize a few people didn't get their boxes yet, so if you didn't send us an email. They were sent out last week, Wednesday, I think. So you should have gotten them by now. And the corn experience will continue tomorrow, like I mentioned, with Frank Kutka and Rebecca Webster. And they're going to be talking about northern Flint corns and other corns that are, you know, have been grown up in the northern region where some of us are, and continuing this discussion of corn. There is a video that Henry sent out to everybody that was produced by Nando, who is showing you how to nixtamalize your corn. And so you should be able to watch that. We sent you corn with the lime that you need to go through that process. So certainly anytime you can get going on that as well. All right. Well, with that, we will hopefully see you all tomorrow. Thank you.